душе моя Господа, благословен єси, Господи, благослови, душе моя Господа, і вся внутрішня моя, ім'я святое.
Thanks very much. It's great to see you all here again. I see a lot of familiar faces, and that's great. It's a good consistency in these things because we've talked about so many different topics over the years that has to do with Catholic-Orthodox relations. And this year, I think the theme is a particularly interesting one, creation, our shared inheritance. And of course, people are going to be reflecting on the encyclical Laudato Si', which has really put the Catholic Church, along with the Orthodox, kind of at the forefront of this whole question. It is kind of an interesting development, which I've also noticed in the North American Orthodox Catholic Theological Consultation, that there's been a couple of trends right now. I'm not sure if it will carry through over the long term, but to kind of not look so much at questions that have divided us historically, but looking at topics that present a common challenge and something that we can face together. And certainly the environment and all the questions about creation and the preservation of our common home, as Francis put it, is one of those questions. It's not as though we have differences on this question, but it's something that we're all concerned about together. So we have a number of speakers that are going to give some very interesting perspectives on this question. Before we start, I would just mention two things and ask your prayers. In particular, of course, for the Holy and Great Council of the Orthodox Church that's taking place as we speak on the island of Crete. This has been underway, the preparations, for quite a few decades, nearly 100 years actually. And so it's finally come to fruition. There have been some problems, of course, with the attendance of some of the Orthodox churches. But it's certainly a historic event in any case. And so I think the outcome of this council will be very important for all of us. And the other thing I would ask your prayers for is that last Sunday, I only heard yesterday, there was an assassination attempt on the Patriarch of the Syrian Orthodox Church, more Ignatius Afram II Karim, who before he was elected Patriarch was the bishop in the United States in New Jersey, and very involved ecumenically here in the United States. But last Sunday there was actually a memorial service for the Syrian Orthodox who died in the genocide of World War I. And it was during that service that a suicide bomber tried to get into the church, was stopped by the bodyguards, but then detonated the explosions and 3 people were killed. But thank goodness the Patriarch was not harmed. So our prayers also go out to him and for his safety. Our first speaker this morning is going to be Paolo Puccini. He was raised in Houston, Texas, and completed a Bachelor of Science in Mechanical Engineering at the University of Texas at Austin in 2009. After getting his degree, he returned to Houston to work for 3 years as a mechanical engineer in the oil industry. But while he was studying in Austin, the campus ministry at the University of Texas, staffed by the Paulist Fathers, had had a profound impact on his life, and this led him to discern a call to the priesthood. So personally, I'm especially happy to report that Paolo entered the Paulist novitiate in 2013 and is currently a Paulist in temporary promises studying theology at the Catholic University of America across the street here in Washington, D.C. He's now beginning his 4th year of formation towards the priesthood. And so for his reflections on the papal encyclical, please welcome Paolo Puccini.
Good morning. Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and thank you to Jack for the invitation to be here and speak with everyone today. So this past Saturday, which was June 18th, marked the 1-year anniversary of the release of Laudato Si'. And in the document, Pope Francis calls for dialogue nearly 20 times. I think this week's conference is a wonderful way to join our voices with the global dialogues that are ongoing about this document. And in many ways, I feel unworthy to share the podium with so many distinguished theologians who are to follow, since I've only had 2 years of formal theological studies. But I hope that my brief overview can set the stage for their following presentations. As I go through this encyclical, I also plan to include some of my own perspectives as a trained engineer and also as a millennial, just to show how relevant these issues are. So first, it's important to note that Laudato Si is a very long text. It has over 40,000 words spread across 256 paragraphs, and my printed copy here is about 140 pages. Pope Francis begins Laudato Si with a review of how recent popes from St. John the 23rd through Pope Benedict the 16th have put forth our ethical obligations towards the environment. As Cardinal Turkson mentioned in last night's remarks, Pope Francis notes how the work of philosophers, scientists, and theologians have very much enriched the Church's thinking on the questions. And in a first for any papal encyclical, Pope Francis cites 3 addresses made by the Ecumenical Patriarch on environmental issues. Pope Francis tells us of the Ecumenical Patriarch's call for repentance and conversion in the face of our destruction towards the environment. Pope Francis also quotes Patriarch Bartholomew's declaration that, and I quote, "To commit a crime against the natural world is a sin against ourselves and a sin against God," end quote. Patriarch Bartholomew finds that the roots of our environmental harms require more than simply technological remedies, and he calls everyone to counter environmental problems with sacrifice, generosity, and asceticism. Pope Francis also notes how the Ecumenical Patriarch desires that Christians come to accept the world as, quote, a sacrament of communion, end quote. These themes put forth by the Ecumenical Patriarch are subsequently developed throughout Laudato Si. So Catholic engagement on social issues often incorporates a method known as see, judge, and act. This process was first mentioned in the encyclical of St. John the 23rd on Christianity and social progress, known as Mater et Magistra. And I think the chapters of Laudato Si roughly follow this 3-step framework. The first chapter corresponds to the first step of seeing. The next 3 chapters provide multifaceted judgments of the current situation, informed, of course, by our faith in the gospel. And then the final 2 chapters of Laudato Si propose numerous pathways for action. So I'm going to go through the 3 different steps to give a brief tour of Laudato Si. Prefacing his first chapter, Pope Francis writes that he hopes to review several aspects of the present ecological crisis with the aim of drawing on the results of the best scientific research available today, letting them touch us deeply and provide a concrete foundation for the ethical and spiritual itinerary that will follow. Pope Francis titles the first chapter, "What is Happening to Our Common Home?" And Pope Francis invites us to, quote, "dare turn what is happening in the world into our own personal suffering, and thus discover what each of us can do about it," end quote. The problems Pope Francis lays out are manifold. He laments the widespread pollution of air, land, and water that have become a daily part of so many people's lives, especially the poor. He observes how climate change caused by greenhouse gases threatens so many people living in coastal areas as sea levels rise. Pope Francis also notes the plight of farmers who suffered from prolonged droughts as weather patterns change. These farmers are often forced to migrate in order to provide for the basic necessities of their families. Pope Francis then turns his analysis towards the issue of water. He observes that there are many who suffer from water scarcity, many who lack the infrastructure to supply clean water, and many who suffer from waterborne illnesses. Humans are intrinsically dependent on the environment for these necessities of life, and Pope Francis is a voice for the poor and marginalized who are directly impacted by this pollution and degradation of the environment. But beyond the essentials of life itself, Pope Francis is also deeply concerned with the relationship between the environment and human dignity, human happiness, human flourishing. Pope Francis outlines the many ways that cities can be unhealthy, such as urban chaos, poor transportation, visual pollution, and noise. Pope Francis emphasizes the necessity of parks and beautiful spaces in the midst of crowded cities, and he worries that such spaces are often very far from where the poor live. Humans are fundamentally relational people, so the Pope explores not only how humans live together physically, but he also studies the way in which humans relate with one another using new media, such as the internet. Pope Francis reminds us that digital media can often facilitate, and I quote, an accumulation of data which eventually leads to an overload and confusion, a sort of mental pollution, end quote. He further cautions that digital media can, quote, shield us from direct contact with the pain, the fears, and the joys of others, and the complexity of their personal experiences, end quote. So as we see, care for the environment involves not only care for air, land, and water, but attention to the means by which we relate with our fellow human beings. As we've seen in this brief summary of the first chapter, Pope Francis lays out an expansive agenda for environmental issues. And there are many others that I unfortunately don't have time to summarize in this reflection. But at the core, Pope Francis wants to show us how everything is related. Pope Francis is especially concerned with how the wealthy who abuse the environment hurt more than just plants and animals. When we hurt the environment, we hurt the poor who are so closely dependent on nature. I was working at the Paulist Mother Church in Midtown Manhattan last summer when I first read Laudato Si. And this opening chapter helped me to see many things about my own environment in a new perspective. People often associate the environment with bucolic images of lakes, mountains, or fields far away from city life, as if the environment was something different than the urban spaces in which we live. Laudato Si helped me to see how my environment in New York City was affecting my own spirituality and my way of relating to others. I found the noise from the street construction to be relentless, as it would echo off the walls of skyscrapers, and the plethora of advertising was quite dizzying. But at the same time, I came to appreciate the blessing of Central Park and the ability to escape the horns of the city streets for some time of reflection. I also admired the widespread use of public transit, even though it was a bit more inconvenient than the cars that I'm used to, coming from Texas, of course. And I hope that as more people become acquainted with Laudato Si, they can see their own environment in new ways. And hopefully it will bring more visibility to the plight of the poor whose suffering is often hidden. Now that we've reviewed the various ways that Pope Francis sees, we can move on to studying how he judges the environmental situation. The second chapter of Laudato Si is entitled The Gospel of Creation, and in it Pope Francis explores the theological foundations for our concern for the environment. He explains how the creation accounts in Genesis, quote, suggest that human life is grounded in three fundamental and closely intertwined relationships: with God, with our neighbor, and with the earth itself. According to the Bible, these three vital relationships have been broken both outwardly and within us. This rupture is sin, end quote. Pope Francis then explains how God's commands to have dominion over the earth and to till and to keep the land have been distorted by the human desire to take the place of God. Instead, we are called to recognize our limits as God's creatures, and in doing so, we can better recognize the limits to how we control nature. Pope Francis reviews subsequent passages throughout Hebrew Scriptures to show how, quote, the laws found in the Bible dwell on relationships, not only among individuals, but also with other living beings, end quote. The Hebrew Scriptures also speak of renewal that comes about through harmonious living with nature and respecting its rhythms. For example, rest on the Sabbath gives both people and their animals a chance for rejuvenation, and the Jubilee year allows for a renewal of relationships among all members of the community, rich and poor alike. So after reviewing our ethical obligations found in Scripture, Pope Francis turns his attention to how the Scriptures inform the very mystery of creation itself. he makes a very important theological distinction between the terms creation and nature, which I think are often used synonymously. Pope Francis writes, quote, "Nature is usually seen as a system which can be studied, understood, and controlled, whereas creation can only be understood as a gift from the outstretched hand of the Father of all, and as a reality illuminated by the love which calls us together into universal communion." End quote. So while Pope Francis has the utmost esteem for the insights that science reveals to us about nature, he reminds us that the fullness of our knowledge can only come when we consider nature in light of God's creative act. To speak of creation, to move beyond a purely immanent understanding of nature. Creation reflects God's free and generous decision to create. Creation reminds us of God's transcendence above the natural order. Creation also reveals that nature is not simply random chaos, but rather has an order that ultimately comes from our Creator and is directed back towards God. Pope Francis then looks to the person of Christ for deeper insights as to the meaning of God's creation. Pope Francis writes that Jesus lived in full harmony with creation, and others were amazed. His appearance was not that of an ascetic set apart from the world. The New Testament also reveals how our risen Lord is directing all things towards the fullness that is himself. Because God orders his creation towards this ultimate end, Pope Francis writes that the mystery of Christ is at work in a hidden manner in the natural world as a whole. Pope Francis continues this process of judging by applying the light of revelation to the implicit philosophical frameworks at the heart of many modern societies. In chapter 3, titled "The Human Roots of the Ecological Crisis," the Pope presents a searing critique of what he calls the technocratic paradigm that dominates economic and political life across the globe. Pope Francis defines the technocratic paradigm as a system that treats nature as something without form and open to manipulation. Technology becomes a means to master, possess, and transform nature. This paradigm ultimately stems from what Pope Francis calls a misguided anthropocentrism and practical relativism. Such lifestyles guided by these ideologies take advantage of both nature and other human beings for the sake of one's own immediate comfort. So Pope Francis calls us to heal these broken relationships with God, with our neighbors, and with creation. In chapter 4, Pope Francis completes this process of judging our present situation by presenting a comprehensive vision of healed relationships. This vision is known as integral ecology because it respects the intrinsic the intrinsic connections between all living creatures. Pope Francis defines ecology as the study of, quote, "the relationship between living organisms and the environment in which they develop," end quote. He explores the ecology of various dimensions of our social life and advocates for an integral way of living, such that the seemingly distinct parts of our lives may be lived with a much greater harmony and may be directed towards the flourishing of all. Pope Francis forcefully declares that, quote, "integral ecology is inseparable from the notion of the common good." And now, throughout these chapters, Pope Francis cites statements made by 11 different conferences of Catholic bishops that come from all of the world's inhabited continents. Pope Francis models his own call for building stronger relationships between various levels of society by including these voices of the bishops who are intimately aware of their local situations. I think Laudato Si provides us with a wonderful example of collegiality. Coming from my brief career as an engineer, I found the Pope's reflection on creation to be both very illuminating and very challenging. Engineers often have the knowledge to bring about precisely the type of manipulation of nature that the Pope laments. And Laudato Si questions some of the fundamental presuppositions of our economic order. But through much reflection, I've come to see the prophetic value of the Pope's message. I see how easy it is to try to reduce nature into scientific theories, but when we do so, we are blinded to the deeper mysteries of our universe. I am moved by the Pope's reminder that nature is ultimately part of a larger drama that involves God's generous love and our free response. Though engineers and scientists have the tools to do much damage to the environment, we also have the means to bring forth societies and businesses that can practice integral ecology. But this is only possible if we come to see the world through the lens of relationships with God and with one another. And I hope that my future priestly ministry can help Christian professionals discern how they can see beyond the limited perspectives offered by science and economics. So after these 3 chapters, judging our contemporary situation through the lens of our faith convictions, Pope Francis turns to the question of action in the final 2 chapters of Laudato Si. Chapter 5 is titled Lines of Approach and Action, and in it the Pope calls for various dialogues across all levels of society. He hopes new agreements at the international, national, and local levels will lead to economic and social policies that better reflect the demands of integral ecology. He also calls for increased dialogue between believers for, quote, the sake of protecting nature, defending the poor, and building networks of respect and fraternity, end quote. And as I said at the beginning, this conference is a wonderful opportunity to respond to that very call. And the Pope also calls for more dialogue between religion and scientists. And while social and political action are very necessary to protect the environment, our ability to resist sin and live in right relation with one another can only be fully realized through spiritual conversion. Pope Francis concludes Laudato Si with the 6th chapter devoted to ecological education and spirituality. In it, he encourages us to resist consumerism and embrace a new lifestyle that is grounded in contemplation and virtue. Pope Francis reminds us that the sacraments bring us to supernatural life by God's works through the elements of nature. And I would be remiss in my remarks if I didn't mention St. John Paul II's apostolic letter, Orientale Lumen, which I understand was the inspiration for these very conferences. Pope Francis writes in Laudato Si that, quote, encountering God does not mean fleeing from this world or turning our back on nature. This is especially clear in the spirituality of the Christian East, end quote. And then Pope Francis quotes these words from the letter Orientale Lumen. Beauty, which in the East is one of the best loved names for expressing the divine harmony and the model of humanity transfigured, appears everywhere, in the shape of a church, in sounds and colors and lights in the sense. Laudato Si calls us to a renewed appreciation of beauty to motivate us towards a deeper respect for God's creation. I'm afraid my brief summary hardly does justice to the breadth and depth of Laudato Si, and my characterization of the chapters according to See, Judge, and Act is perhaps a bit of an oversimplification. I hope the Pope's message will inspire you to see your environment with new eyes, to judge the situation more deeply in light of the gospel, and to discern new ways that you can act, both practically and spiritually. I also pray that this conference will serve as a chance for all of us to share our respective insights from this process of seeing, judging, and acting in accord with our religious traditions. And through this, hopefully, we can find new pathways for unity. So I would like to conclude my remarks with a brief excerpt from the prayer of Pope Francis that concludes Laudato Si. Triune Lord, wondrous community of infinite love, teach us to contemplate you in the beauty of the universe, for all things speak of you. Awaken our praise and thankfulness for every being that you have made. Give us the grace to feel profoundly joined to everything that is. Amen. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paolo, for a fine introduction to the theme of our conference. We're going to now hear from someone who needs no introduction. Jack Fiegel is the founder and great spiritual figure of these conferences over many years now. And so we will take a few moments now to hear from him. Thank you.
I think in 20 years, this is the first time I'm sort of addressing any substance of our conferences, but in fact, I'm not going to. I'm simply going to read a paper prepared by the personal advisor to Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew, Father Deacon John Chrysavas, who's written books and essays and papers on the subject of the environment, and as I said, as a direct advisor to His All Holiness. And we invited Deacon John to be with us, and he said he was very honored to be invited and would have loved to have been here. But he too, unfortunately, is one of the consultors and the secretariat for the meeting on Crete. And he knew about it months ago, so he declined because of the schedule conflict. But he agreed to let me read an essay that he has prepared that gives an overview of the Ecumenical Patriarchs Symposium, their topics, and the Ecumenical Patriarchs' commitment to the environment. So before I read that paper, I would like to show a short video clip that His All Holiness prepared just for our conference on this theme. So John, if you want to cue it up, we can listen to His All Holiness directly.
It is with great joy that we greet all of you from the Ecumenical Patriarchate on the occasion of the 20th anniversary of Orientale Lumen. Your decision to mark this milestone by reflecting on the environmental vision and efforts of both East and West accurately depicts some of the most significant characteristics of your annual Orientale Lumen Conferences. For there cannot be any isolated or separated response to God's creation which transcends religious, political, and national interests. Since we have personally dedicated much of our own patriarchal ministry toward this very end, we are delighted to see that ecological awareness has become more visible and more ecumenical. There is, of course, much more that must be accomplished, and for this we entreat the Lord to strengthen us in our effort to preserve the gift of His creation for future generations. We congratulate you on your significant anniversary and convey to all of you, organizers and participants alike, our fervent paternal prayers for a fruitful gathering. God bless you all.
So I think we all should be very honored that His All Holiness took time to prepare these brief greetings. It's somewhat historic for us to receive such a video. I, of course, thank His All Holiness for his ongoing support for the Orientale Lumen Conferences over the years. We've had 3 of these such conferences in Constantinople with his participation and welcoming us. When I was there in April and had a conversation with him in the preparation of this video, he asked me about the next conference in Constantinople, and I said, yes, indeed, we were planning one for this October, the last 2 weeks. And then he got his diary out and asked me when I wanted him to come greet our group, which I found amazing. And he wrote down the date, and he's planning to come to our hotel. So if you would like the opportunity to meet His All Holiness directly, please see me and I'll give you more details. There's also brochures about that trip to both Rome and Constantinople out on the desk. So I'd like to now proceed with reading the paper of Deacon John Chrysavas entitled The Green Patriarch, Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew, and the Protection of the Environment. Introduction. In the past 2 decades, the world has witnessed alarming environmental degradation, with climate change, the loss of biodiversity, and the pollution of natural resources, and the widening gap between rich and poor, as well as increasing failure to implement environmental policies. During the same decade, one religious leader has discerned the signs of the times and called people's attention to this ecological and social situation. His All Holiness Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew has persistently proclaimed the primacy of spiritual values in determining environmental ethics and action. His endeavors have earned him the title Green Patriarch, coined and publicized in the media in 1996, while being formalized at the White House in 1997 by Al Gore, Vice President of the United States. In 2008, Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew was named one of Time magazine's 100 most influential people in the world for, quote, defining environmentalism as a spiritual responsibility. 2, initiatives and actions. The environmental initiatives of the Environmental Patriarchate date back to the mid-1980s, with the 3rd session of the pre-synodal Pan-Orthodox Conference held in Chambasy in 1986, a precursor of this week's meeting on Crete. Representatives at this meeting expressed concern for the abuse of the natural environment, especially in affluent Western societies. The emphasis was on leaving a better world for future generations. Echo Laudato Si. Several inter-Orthodox meetings followed on the subject of justice, peace, and the integration of creation, attended by Orthodox representatives. One such consultation was held on Patmos, Greece in 1988 to mark the 900th anniversary of the historic monastery of St. John the Theologian, which our Orientale Lumen group visited the last time we were there 5 years ago. The then Ecumenical Patriarch Demetrius assigned Metropolitan John Zuzoulis of Pergamon as patriarchal representative to this conference entitled Revelation and the Future of Humanity, and organized jointly by the Ecumenical Patriarchate and the Greek Ministry of Cultural Affairs in cooperation with local civil authorities. One of the primary recommendations of this conference was that the Ecumenical Patriarchate should designate one day each year for the protection of the natural environment. In 1989, the same Patriarch Demetrius published the first encyclical letter on the environment. This encyclical proclaimed on the occasion of the first day of the new ecclesiastical calendar, formerly established as 1st of September, as a day for all Orthodox Christians within the jurisdiction of the Ecumenical Patriarchate to offer prayers for the preservation of the natural creation. A similar encyclical is published annually on the first day of September. Note, first day of September in Pope Francis's message of Laudato Si. In 1990, the foremost hymnographer on Mount Athos, Monk Gerasimos, was commissioned by the Ecumenical Patriarchate to compose a service of supplication for the environment. Whereas in the past, Orthodox faithful prayed to be delivered from natural calamities, they were now called to pray that the planet may be delivered from the abusive and destructive acts of human beings. A month after his election in 1991, so now just a few years later, Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew convened an ecological gathering in Crete entitled Living in the Creation of the Lord. That convention was opened by Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, and International Chairman of the World Wildlife Fund. In the following year, Patriarch Bartholomew called an unprecedented meeting of all Orthodox patriarchs and primates at the Phanar, the headquarters in Constantinople, Istanbul, submitting an historical expression of unity and inviting all Orthodox leaders to inform their churches about the critical significance of this issue for our times. The primates endorsed September 1st as a day of pan-Orthodox prayer for the environment. Part 3, Seminars and Symposia. In the summer of 1992, the Duke of Edinburgh visited the Phanar for an environmental convocation at the Theological School of Halki, an island off the coast in the Sea of Marmara. In November 1993, a year later, the Ecumenical Patriarch returned the visit, meeting with the Duke at Buckingham Palace, where they sealed a friendship of common purpose and active cooperation for the preservation of the environment. In June 1994, yet now another year later, an ecological seminar was convened also at the Historical School of Halki, the first of 5 successive annual summer seminars on diverse aspects of the environment: religious education in 1994, ethics in 1995, communications in 1996, justice in 1997, and poverty in 1998. Notice commonality of themes. These seminars, the first held at such a level in any Orthodox Church context, were designed to promote environmental awareness and action, engaging leading theologians, environmentalists, scientists, civil servants, and especially students, as we heard from this morning. In October 1994, the University of the Aegean conferred an honorary doctorate degree on Patriarch Bartholomew, the first of a series of awards and honorary degrees presented to the Patriarch in recognition of his efforts and initiatives for the environment. In November 2000, the New York-based organization Scenic Hudson presented the Ecumenical Patriarch with the first International Visionary Award for environmental achievement. In 2002, a few years later, Patriarch Bartholomew was the recipient of the Sophie Prize in Norway and the Binding Environmental Prize in Liechtenstein, each presented to an individual or organization that has pioneered environmental awareness and action. Convinced that any appreciation of the environmental concerns of our times must occur in dialogue with other Christian confessions, other religious faiths, as well as scientific disciplines, in 1994, Patriarch Bartholomew established the Religious and Scientific Committee. Chaired by Metropolitan John of Pergamon, its extraordinary events are coordinated by Ms. Maria Beckett, and to date, the Religious and Scientific Committee has hosted 7 international, interdisciplinary, and interreligious symposia to reflect on the fate of the rivers and seas and to force the pace of religious debate on the natural environment. Symposium 1 was entitled Revelation in the Environment. It was convened in September of 1995 under the joint auspices of Patriarch Bartholomew and Prince Philip on the occasion of the 1900th anniversary of St. John's Book of Revelation. And in his opening address, the Patriarch noted, "The earth has been hurt," Revelation 7:3. "Conscious of the threat of nuclear destruction and environmental pollution, we shall move toward one world or none." Symposium number 2, held in 1997, was entitled The Black Sea in Crisis, under the joint auspices of the Ecumenical Patriarch and His Excellency Jacques Santer, President of the European Commission. This symposium undertook a concrete case study, visiting the countries that surround the Black Sea and engaging in conversation with local religious leaders and environmental activists, as well as regional scientists and politicians. A direct result of this symposium, the Halki Ecological Institute was organized in June of 1999 to promote wider regional collaboration and education among 75 clergy and theologians, educators and students, as well as scientists and journalists. This initiative marked a new direction in interdisciplinary vision and dialogue, implementing the ecological theory of the Religious and Scientific Committee into practice. Symposium number 3 was titled River of Life, Down the Danube to the Black Sea, and it was launched in October of 1999 under the joint auspices of Patriarch Bartholomew and His Excellency Romano Prodi, President of the European Commission at that time. Participants traveled the length of the Danube River from Germany to the Ukraine in the aftermath of the military and ethnic conflict in the former Yugoslavia. Symposium number 4 was titled The Adriatic Sea, a Sea at Risk, a Unity of Purpose, and it addressed the ethical aspects of the environmental crisis. Held in June of 2002 under the joint auspices of the Patriarch and His Excellency Romano Prodi, again, President of the European Commission. This symposium opened in Durrës, Albania, and concluded in Venice, Italy, where the Patriarch co-signed a document of environmental ethics with Pope John II via satellite link-up. The Venice Declaration, as it's known, is the first joint text of the two leaders on ecological issues. Symposium 5 was titled The Baltic Sea, A Common Heritage, a Shared Responsibility. It was organized in June of 2003. The end of the Cold War had permitted the renewal of political, economic, social, cultural, and religious ties between this region and countries comprising the European Union and the wider world. Organized under the patronage of the Ecumenical Patriarch, and again Romano Prodi, President of the European Commission, the symposium also resulted in the North Sea Conference, co-sponsored by the Patriarchate and the Church of Norway. And symposium number 6 was titled The Amazon, Source of Life, was held in July of 2006 on the Amazon River under the patronage of the Patriarch and His Excellency Kofi Annan, Secretary General of the United Nations. This symposium concentrated on the global dimensions of problems stemming directly from the Amazon, problems which have perhaps dropped out of view for many decision makers. Symposium number 7 was titled The Arctic Mirror of Life and was held in the fall of 2007, directing its attention to the Arctic Sea. Under the joint auspices of Their Excellency Jose Barroso, President of the European Commission, Kofi Annan, former Secretary General of the UN, the symposium considered the plight of indigenous populations, the fragility of the sea ice, and the encroachment of oil exploration in a region considered to be one of the first victims of human-induced climate change. Symposium number 8 was titled The Great Mississippi River, Restoring Balance, and was held October 25th from 18 to 25 of 2009. Of the world's greatest rivers, the Mississippi is among those which has fallen most completely under human domination. With a total length of 3,778 kilometers, remember Deacon John's writing for the Patriarchate, so it's kilometers, not miles, and the third largest drainage basin on Earth, a chain of cities along its length has discharged domestic and industrial waste into the Mississippi for nearly 2 centuries. Yet the fate of the Mississippi waters is an ethical crisis. The exploitation of the great river produces catastrophic human and natural consequences, as observed in the lessons of the Katrina hurricane. The Mississippi is a challenge not only to human responsibility for the environment itself, but indeed to democracy itself. Part 4, Environment and Spirituality. With reference to the environmental initiatives and actions, what is perhaps most characteristic of the Patriarch's initiatives is the mark of humility. The Ecumenical Patriarch is able to see the larger picture. He recognizes that he is standing before something greater than himself, a world before which he must kneel, a chain that long predates and will long outlast him. Therefore, he speaks of self-emptying, kenosis in Greek, ministry, diakonia, witness, martyria, which is also a term that means martyrdom and suffering, and thanksgiving, or Eucharista in Greek, the term which implies liturgy. The emphasis is always on humble simplicity. The technical term in Orthodox spirituality is asceticism, to work up raw material with skill, to exercise by training or discipline, and on liturgy, ministration, ministry, and service as essential sources of Orthodox theology. The notion of liturgy leads us into what is perhaps the most distinctive feature of the Patriarch's vision, namely the concept of communion, koinonia, which also means communication and fellowship. Some of the central scriptural passages or events that comprise the foundation for the Ecumenical Patriarch's conviction about the Sacred Commission and obligation to protect the environment include the creation of the world by the loving Creator, Genesis 1:26, and Genesis 2:15 about the need to serve and preserve creation. Genesis 9:8-17 about the covenant between God and the world. Ezekiel 34:18-19 about using and not abusing creation, as well as the Lord's Beatitudes, Matthew 5:2-12, and the Transfiguration on Mount Tabor, Mark 9:2-3. For Patriarch Bartholomew, this is a matter of truthfulness to God, humanity, and the created order. He condemns environmental abuse as nothing less than sin. In Santa Barbara in November of 1997, he declared, quote, "To commit a crime against the natural world is a sin. For human beings to cause species to become extinct and to destroy the biological diversity of God's creation, for human beings to degrade the integrity of the earth by causing changes in its climate, by stripping the earth of its natural force, or by destroying its wetlands. For human beings to injure other human beings with disease by contaminating the earth's water, its land, its air, and its life with poisonous substances, all of these are sins." End quote. The environment is not only a political or a technological issue. It is, as Patriarch Bartholomew likes to underline, primarily a religious and spiritual issue. Patriarch Bartholomew invariably relates the environment to a familiar aspect of Orthodox spirituality, namely to the icons that decorate Orthodox churches. Symbols are important in Orthodox thought, worship, and life. Creation itself is likened to an icon, just as the human person is created, quote, "in the image and likeness of God," Genesis and Colossians. The Patriarch invites people to contemplate the God creator through the icon of the created world. In the same vein, Patriarch Bartholomew refers to the human beings as endowed by God to serve as priests, underlining that personal responsibility for the physical world and the slightest action of even the feeblest among us who can change the world for the better. Finally, the Ecumenical Patriarch is aware that environmental issues are intimately connected to and dependent on numerous other social issues of our times, including war and peace, justice and human rights, poverty and unemployment, themes we just heard about in Laudato Si. It is not by chance that the term eco-justice has been used in religious circles to describe this interconnection between creation and creatures, between the world and its inhabitants. We have in recent years become increasingly aware of the effects of environmental degradation on people, and especially the poor. Part 5, worldview and vision. Unfortunately, we tend to forget our connection to the earth and our environment. There is a binding unity and continuity that we share with all of God's creation, and in recent years we have been reminded of this truth with flora and fauna extinction, with soil and forest clearance, and with noise, air, and water pollution. Concern for the environment is not an expression of superficial or sentimental love. It is a way of honoring and dignifying our creation by the hand and word of God. It is a way of listening to the groaning of creation, Romans 8:22. We tend to call this crisis an ecological crisis, which is a fair description insofar as its results are manifested in the ecological sphere. Yet the crisis is not first of all ecological. It is a crisis concerning the way we perceive reality, the way we imagine our world. We treat our planet in an inhuman, God-forsaken manner precisely because we see it in this way, precisely because we see ourselves in this way. Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew offers a refreshing alternative way of seeing ourselves in relation to the natural world. In conclusion, as a religious leader, the Ecumenical Patriarch's initiatives to protect the environment are worthy of emulation. His worldview, derived from the ancient values of the Orthodox Church, deserve our attention. End of his paper. Thank you.
Щедрий милостив Господь, дотерпеливий много милостив. Благослови, душе моя Господа, и вся внутренняя моя, имя святое Его, благослови си Господь.